Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem Zen, and our guest today is Seth Zuiho Segall, a Zen Buddhist priest, clinical psychologist, and writer. He has served on the clinical faculty of the Yale University School of Medicine for nearly 3 decades. He's also a science writer for the Mindfulness Research Monthly, a contributing editor for Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, and a review editor for the Humanistic Psychologist. Seth has been engaged with meditation and Buddhism for almost 30 years and is ordained in the White Plum lineage. He currently leads Pamsula Zen of Westchester and guest teaches at the New York Insight Meditation Center. He's also the author of several books, including Buddhism and Human Flourishing, and his latest, The House We Live In. He writes consistently on his blog, The Existential Buddhist, covering a range of Buddhist topics from a naturalized, pragmatic, eudaimonic, and cosmopolitan perspective. In our conversation today, we cover a wide range of topics from a naturalistic versus secular Buddhism, wisdom, ethics and pluralism, a vision of flourishing, political polarization, Seth's experience of becoming a Zen priest, and some useful ways of thinking about and approaching enlightenment. Enjoy. Seth Zuiho Segall, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here with you, Artem.
Yeah. So I just want to set some context before we dive in. A little while back, a listener of this podcast recommended you as a guest. And more recently, I had a chance to read some of your blog, The Existential Buddhist, as well as your latest book, The House We Live In. And I thought there was a lot of rich content in your writing, and there's many threads I'd like to explore today. But maybe we could start with what you call a naturalistic, pragmatic, eudaimonic, and cosmopolitan Buddhism. Yeah. Can you explain what you mean by this and how that might contrast with traditional expressions of Buddhism?
Sure. Well, I've been a Buddhist practitioner for about 30 years right now. And I'll just preface what I'm saying by saying I've found the practice to be incredibly beneficial and enriching in my life, transformative, so that I have a great love for the practice. But when I look at the theory that undergirds the practice, when I read the ancient suttas and sutras and sastras and so forth, and look at all the philosophy behind it, I find that there's a lot that I disagree with. I was, first of all, I'm a clinical psychologist. I was educated as a scientist. Actually started out as an undergraduate in biochemistry. So I'm very well steeped in the sciences. And so there are a lot of assumptions that Buddhism makes that I just can't accept. So I take a kind of pragmatic view of things. Things could be true, might be true, might not be true, but what's the evidence for it? And if there isn't any evidence for it, I just have to remain agnostic about it and say, I have no idea if it's true or not. So I'm that way about the idea of rebirth, in terms of being reborn into hells or heavens or other realms and so forth. I have no evidence for or against it in any way, so I don't put any emphasis on that. I don't believe that the universe is structured in such a way that karma makes sure that everything is just in the world, that it's like a naturalistic process in the world. I don't believe that. I don't believe that there's such a thing as perfect and unsurpassed enlightenment, that there's a place that we can reach in which we know the true nature of everything and we have 100% wisdom and 100% compassion. And I just don't believe that on the basis that I've never met anyone like that, despite 30 years of Buddhist practice. And I've met, I've seen the Dalai Lama, I've seen Thich Nhat Hanh, I've seen all kinds of great teachers over the years, and I've learned a lot from them, but I haven't met anyone who seems perfectly enlightened to me in the way they behave or makes the claim of being perfectly enlightened. So does that state exist? Well, I don't know. As a psychologist, I tend to doubt it. I don't think our brains can change that much, that we get rid of our amygdalas and, so the idea that we reach a state where we no longer have desire arising anymore, for example, or no attachments. I don't believe in that. Or a state that which we never become irritated again, period. I don't believe in that. So instead of thinking about enlightenment as a permanent absolute state that we can achieve, I think about it as a horizon we kind of aim at in some kind of way. And we may make some progress in that direction, but we never reach a complete state where we're now these masters of the universe. So I tend to be very skeptical about those sorts of claims. So that's what I mean by pragmatic. If there's no evidence that I can see for it, I don't want to say that it's true. Cosmopolitan means that I don't think the Buddha is the only person who is the wise person in the world. That yes, the Buddha is very important to me, but so is Aristotle, so is Confucius, so are many modern philosophers. Whether it's John Dewey or Martha Nussbaum, there are plenty of very wise people around all throughout history, and it helps to listen to everybody, not just one person, and say this person has the truth, and therefore you don't need to listen to anyone else. So that's the cosmopolitan part. Eudaimonic means that the purpose for me of Buddhist practice is to increase our well-being, to make our lives better in some kind of way. So eudaimonia is Aristotle's word for a kind of state of well-being or happiness that we can achieve, and that we can never be perfectly happy, but we can be a lot happier. I think about that book, 10% Happier. So I think that's the aim. The aim of Buddhist practice is to kind of create a sense of well-being for ourselves that includes not only our own personal well-being, but concerns for other people. We want to create a society in which people can all maximize their state of well-being. So that's kind of the Bodhisattva vow, to kind of try to bring everyone across to a higher level of well-being. Did I leave out any of the adjectives? I had pragmatic, eudaimonic, cosmopolitan. What was the other one?
Naturalistic.
Naturalistic means that I don't believe in supernatural stuff. I don't believe in cosmological Buddhas. I don't believe about Buddha lands and Buddha realms and pure realms and so forth. I don't believe in as you read the Buddhist sutras, you find all kinds of imaginary creatures, whether it's devas and brahmas or all kinds of elfin-like creatures and so forth that live in the forests. I just don't go for that. They're good stories, and there's maybe something to learn from those stories, and in terms of kind of a moral lessons and so forth, but I don't actually believe in the existence of supernatural forces or beings. So that's that. So in a way, It's a very modernized kind of Buddhism. And interestingly, it probably, for most practitioners throughout history, they might not recognize that as Buddhism at all, because for them, Buddhism might have been earning merit or trying to get to a better rebirth or something like that. I mean, most practitioners didn't meditate, for example, throughout history. Even most monks didn't meditate. So, and there's some schools of Buddhism, like Pure Land, where meditation isn't even encouraged. And yet for me, it's the meditation. I'm a Zen practitioner, and for me, it's meditation that's been one of the most important parts of practice for me, and transformative.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you unpacking this. And I guess the part I'm curious is naturalistic. Would you say naturalistic is the same as secular? No,
I wouldn't. Because there are a lot of religious aspects to Buddhism that I really appreciate. I like ritual. I like what one of my teachers called the smells and bells, the incense, and I find, for example, that if I'm going to be sitting down this Saturday, my Zen group is doing what's called the Zazen Kai, which is an extended half-day sitting period, and I find that setting off a kind of a ritualistic space to do the sitting in, doing initial bows, initial chanting, and lighting the incense, creates a kind of a whole set of expectations and a whole, it readies the room, it transforms the room in some ways, a place where sitting is really going to be very, very deep and profound. So I find some of those ritualistic aspects of Buddhism very, very appealing. So if secular means not believing in a supernatural deity, I guess it's secular. But if it means, I also appreciate the kinds of very deep meditative experiences we sometimes have that suggest some kind of deeper connection to the world or nature or the unity of the world, and so which goes beyond secularity. I'm remembering one particular experience I had on a retreat where I left the retreat hall and went outside. It was the middle of winter, and everything looked perfect and beautiful to me. And I felt myself in love with the trees and the rocks and the clouds and everything. And there was a feeling that love was coming back in some kind of way. And I was just in tears, as I kind of walked around out there. And I don't know how that kind of fits in with a kind of a secular view of the universe. It hints at something beyond, maybe what we already know scientifically about the world.
Yes. So do you believe that there's like a limitation in secular Buddhism? Like, is there something that is being missed or not being able to be accessed without like the rituals, the ceremonies, kind of like the symbolism?
I wouldn't say it's lacking. I have many good friends in the secular Buddhist world, and I don't want to disparage the amount of what they achieve through their practice, the amount of transformation in any way, shape, or form. I'm just saying that it's not my route into this. For example, if I can imagine for some people who have had a very bad past experience with the religion they were born into, the idea of all these rituals might be very off-putting and may actually hinder practice. I'll give you an example. My own background is Jewish. And for about 10 years, I attended a zendo that met in a church. Okay. And it took me a while to be able to, I had never entered a church at all until I was 20 years old and went to a friend's marriage. And for me, it was a still somewhat alien place. And the idea that I was sitting in a church with a crucifix and all the stained glass windows, at first it took me a while to kind of say, is this okay? Can I do this? And eventually the church was a lovely place. When it was windy out, all the rafters creaked and, the light coming through the stained glass windows was beautiful. It was a wonderful place to practice. But at first, it was a hindrance to me in some ways. So I can see that there are other people who might find that because of their past religious experiences, secular Buddhist practices is the best one for them.
Yeah, no, that's fair. You mentioned agnosticism, and but you also mentioned that you don't believe in like devas. But isn't that taking a stance? Isn't that veering off of agnosticism? Isn't that veering into like a belief then? Like, I don't believe.
Well, it's where I would bet money. In other words, could there be unicorns and gnomes and devas? Sure. I haven't traveled the whole world. I haven't visited every cave in Tibet and so forth. I mean, on the other hand, if I had to bet on whether anyone's going to find a unicorn or a deva, I would bet against it right now. I guess it's a matter of what are my prior beliefs and how much am I sure about? Am I sure about them? No. They could be, what I'm thinking could be disproven. Someone could bring a unicorn before me and I'd say, oh, I was wrong. But at least that's the way I'd bet right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a couple of other things I was curious about. Well, you said that your background was in, you're Jewish. That's also my background. I mean, my father is Jewish. So technically, in the Jewish tradition, I wouldn't be considered Jewish because my father is Jewish. My mother, she comes from a Christian Orthodox background. But I guess I'm curious what made you interested in Buddhism, what attracted you to that. It's interesting sometimes because I'm also interested in Buddhism, and I'd have this conversation with one of my friends who's Catholic, and he grew up that way, right? He grew up as a Catholic, and that's, he's entrenched in that kind of path. And he would be like, well, why don't you pursue Judaism? Why did you go for Buddhism? So I'm curious what that was for you, what that was like for you.
Well, there were two stories about how I got started. An early story when I was an adolescent, and I was an undergraduate in college, and this fellow by the name of Alan Watts came to our school for a week and gave a series of lectures. So that got me curious, and so I was reading everything I could at that point in English, which was not a lot in the 1960s, but there were some books you could get. But I wasn't, at that point, there wasn't a teacher around, there wasn't a group to practice with. So it was just an intellectual thing, right? It never became a real practice in some kind of way. But then later on in my mid 40s, as a practicing psychologist, I was working with a lot of chronic pain patients. And I was using things like, biofeedback and hypnosis. And I was not terribly, impressed with my success rate in that. I was always looking for other ways. And I watched a television program that Bill Moyers had on PBS called The Healing of the Mind. And one of the things he featured in that was a hour-long segment on John Kabat-Zinn, who was teaching chronic pain patients to meditate over at the University of Massachusetts Health Center in Worcester, Mass. And by and by, I was very impressed by what I saw. It reminded me of my adolescence and my enthusiasm about Alan Watts and so forth. It kind of brought back some feelings about that. And I met one of his teachers and I said, well, how can I do an internship there? And she said, well, you can do an internship up there, which I eventually did. But first, she says, you have to have had at least a year's worth of daily meditation practice, and you have had to have been on at least one 10-day silent retreat at a Buddhist monastery. So I say, okay, I'll do that. And what I discovered was that this was not, while I might use this practice somewhat in therapy for some patients, what I was finding is the value of it was not its value for me as a therapist, but it was a value for me personally. I was at a particular point in my life where my meditating was profoundly changed my perspective on a lot of things I was involved in, and from there I went on and did my internship with Captain Zen over at the Center for Mindfulness, and then I began doing a lot of retreats, starting out in the Insight meditation tradition over at the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Mass, and the Cambridge Insight Meditation Society over in Boston. And I began working with Toni Packer too, in I'm trying to remember the name of her center, and it's just south of Rochester, an hour south of Rochester. So, that's how I got started in it. But I still was attending temple at that point. And what I was discovering as I was going along was I believed almost all the things I was hearing in Buddhism about attachment and not holding on to or rejecting experience and the causes of suffering and so forth. I found all that tremendously relevant to my life. But when I looked at what the central tenets of Judaism were, as I understood them, that there is a God, that he gave the Torah to Moses and not Sinai, that he chose the Jews as a chosen people, that one is not supposed to mix milk and meat, or, we circumcise our children, go down the whole list. None of those appealed to me as things that felt deeply true in any kind of way I could affirm. So I started taking some actual additional courses with the rabbi at my temple, just to make sure that I wasn't making a mistake. But eventually I said, the temple doesn't still hold for me what it used to hold. And it made much more sense for me to kind of go the Buddhist route. At that point, I actually knew a fellow who was both a Orthodox Jew who comes from a long line of Orthodox rabbis, and was also someone who went to meditation retreats at the Insight Meditation Society. And I said to him, I knew that then there was also a Jewish meditation movement going on. I said, how come you don't go to that? And he says, well, it's not Buddhist enough and it's not Jewish enough. So instead he was going to go down those dual tracks.
No, I really appreciate interfaith dialogue and trying to understand what makes somebody go into a specific tradition and what is maybe afforded by one tradition that's not afforded by another tradition. And I also wonder if there's a certain disposition that people have psychologically that they're just kind of, one tradition speaks to them more. It does, obviously Buddhism has beliefs and these kind of things as well, but I wonder if it's in general kind of more agnostic. Somebody, I was talking to somebody recently, and his issue with Buddhism was it's too agnostic. It's it's an agnostic religion, and something in him needed a affirmation of God, right? And it's Buddhism is more kind of agnostic. So it's kind of interesting how people are kind of interested in different perspectives, different religions.
And it's not that you can't find a lot that I get at Buddhism in Judaism. It's just not the way I was taught about it when I was in Hebrew school and so forth. It was you can find passages in the Talmud, for example, that feel very much like Buddhist passages, and there's an emphasis on chesed, which is like loving kindness, and Buddhism compassion, rachmanos. That's there, and you can find it in the tradition. And I think there are some rabbis right now who are bringing that out more to the forefront. But it wasn't. It just couldn't work for me the way I had been educated in Buddhism. It just didn't appeal to me anymore. Except as it appeals to me like the way you kind of finally remember an old girlfriend, But it's not who I'm married to now.
Yeah, no, and it seems like you really made an effort. Like you said, you were doing classes with the rabbi to try to see if there's something that you're missing, but it just wasn't landing with you.
That's exactly right. And I think there are other people for whom there are clear Jewish ways forward, towards Jewish meditation and emphasis on compassion and so forth. I think there are roots there that people can find. It just didn't work for me.
Yeah, there was a thought that I was having before, but I didn't bring it up about secularism, secular Buddhism. So I want to kind of come back to that again. And I think the argument, right, against secular Buddhism is that in removing the cosmology, the symbolism, the ethical framework, that it loses some of its transformative power. Also, some would argue that secular Buddhism smuggles in its own religious system. So secularism becomes a religion in itself, even though it claims to be free of religion. And maybe I could read one little segment. I'm curious so there's a practitioner, somebody that I know, he's lived in a monastery for a while. And I don't think he lives there anymore, but he does a lot of like writing on this stuff. And this is what he wrote. He said, it's interesting because you also brought up Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he says, Jon Kabat-Zinn's strategic secularization of mindfulness illustrates this process. His deliberate removal of Buddhist terminology and cosmology to create MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, undoubtedly brought certain meditative benefits to wider audiences, but simultaneously stripped away elements that might challenge status quo values. Corporate mindfulness programs derived from these approaches help employees better tolerate stress-inducing systems rather than questioning those systems' fundamental nature. And yeah, this is by Daniel Torsen. So yeah, I'm just interested in hearing what you think, because it's like,
I have a couple of comments on that. I mean, yeah. One is that John received a lot of deep training both in Zen and in insight meditation. I've been with him on insight meditation retreats. I know that he ran the Cambridge Zen Center for a while. And John, although he uses secular language, fully understands all the depth of Buddhist practice. I don't know. He embodies it too. He's an extraordinary human being, and I don't want to deprecate him. The other thing is that of the secular Buddhists I know, people like Stephen Batchelor, for example, who I've had wonderful conversations with, and Mike Slott, who runs the Secular Buddhist Network. I don't think they take second place to anyone as people who embody the practice and understand it in a very deep way. And I don't want to say anything against them at all. Now, this other question, the kind of Ron Purser and David Loy criticism of McMindfulness and the way that it reinforces the status quo in some kind of way. I, again, don't think I understand that there may be programs out there like that. Okay. But I have run mindfulness programs, for example, within a local Pepsi Cola company and so forth. And I don't approve of what Pepsi Cola does. They make a product that's toxic, and I can say all kinds of things negative about it. But the way that I taught it, I don't think there was anything there that said accommodate yourself to the situation and learn to live with it. I think what mindfulness does, even secularized mindfulness, and even MBSR does, is it teaches people to be fully present in the moment, to attend to all the information that they're getting externally and internally in the moment, and then using discerning wisdom to make wise choices about what really leads to betterment in one's life and what really cramps one's life or diminishes one's life. So I'm remembering what one of my early teachers made, Larry Rosenberg, over at the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center, when he said, imagine, a mindfulness student or a Buddhist student in a meditation hall, and the meditation hall catches fire. He says, would the student just be sitting there going warm, warmer still, even warmer, very, very warm? He says, no. He says, a really mindful person would be the first one to get up and help everyone out of the building. That's what wisdom would teach you in that moment. So I don't think that, and the other thing that I learned in MBSR when I was taking it in order to learn how to do it, one of the things they taught us was a kind of a four-step way of living. And the first one is show up, because 90% of life is just showing up, be there. The second is pay attention. And the third is do what's needed or say what's true. And then the fourth is let go of thinking that you control the consequences of it. Do what you have to do, what you're called to do in that moment. Then get informed by feedback from the world, social world, the environment about whether what you did was helpful or not. And then be present again and pay attention. And then again, do what's important, to speak your truth. So for me, the training was always about making an appropriate response to the world that we find ourselves in. It wasn't just being passive. But I hear that criticism, and there may be cases where it's right. I've also spoken with Amishi Jha, who organized the military training, for combat, people going into combat. And certainly her idea was not that you should learn to be a good soldier. Her view of things was, when you're in a crisis situation and you are holding a gun and you don't know whether the people in front of you are civilians or combatants, he says, take a breath. Don't just start shooting, It means be calm, be cool, collect, take all the information in before you respond. Take that pause. And I think that's valuable training for soldiers. It's not saying, become captives of the capitalist system. It's saying be mindful, be responsible for your actions.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is also kind of a fascinating conversation. Like, on one end, it's like you want to democratize these methods and these teachings and these kind of things and make them more accessible. And then if you look traditionally, right, to get a lot of these teachings, you would need to have a teacher. You would need to maybe get ordained, join a monastery. And there was kind of some gatekeeping around that. So obviously there's a lot of limitations in that of who can access that. And now in modernity and a lot of these teachings are widespread, but then it also kind of, there is this, argument that these teachings are getting diluted and everybody's accessing. And I've heard the same thing with like kind of yoga, like how yoga was a very different practice in India, and then it comes overseas to America and it becomes about looking good, right? Like sculpting your body, where it was about like health and like realizing, having deeper spiritual realizations. So it's interesting how I can see both of those things, like there being a positive and a negative, in gating everything and saying, oh, the only way you can get this is if you join this monastery and work with this teacher for X amount of years. And then there's also something in that anybody could access this. And, there's kind of like, maybe it loses a certain standard of what is possible.
Yeah. I mean, but things change all the time. If you read, the Yoga Sutras, for example, there's nothing about postures and asanas there, or hardly anything about it. It's not until about a century ago that in India, some form of yoga developed that was mostly about postures and so forth. And so now it comes to, gyms in America and so forth. But I guess these traditions are always in transition, and there's always a way they can be perverted. So I think, for example, the way that that Buddhists in Burma, Myanmar, use Buddhism as a way of persecuting, the Muslims in the state, or the way that Buddhists in Sri Lanka, used it to persecute the Tamils. There's always a way in which Buddhism can be perverted into something that feels. We could talk about the Japanese Zen masters during World War II and the way they supported the Japanese war effort and justified it. So there's a way that religion always can be perverted in some kind of way and always has to be rescued from that.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that comes up is this notion of authentic Buddhism, right? Like what is the authentic Dharma? Mm-hmm. In your estimation, is that probably a myth, right? Like there is no such thing as like a pure, because there's always an interpretation. There's always, even if you go with Theravada and like the earliest texts of the Buddha, it's somehow there's still this cultural element that we can't get away from. So who's to say that like what you're practicing is authentic Dharma?
And there are many, many different forms of Buddhism. In fact, I prefer not to talk about Buddhism at all, but Buddhisms. Mm-hmm. Theravada is not the earliest Buddhism. There were 17 schools before Theravada. Theravada doesn't really develop until Sri Lanka, fully develop around the first century or so, AD. So Buddhism has already been around for hundreds of years before Theravada comes along. And it's really born around the same time, roughly the same time that Mahayana is. So the first Mahayana sutras are being written down in Sanskrit at the same time that the first Pali sutras are being written down in Pali. And then you can say, well, all right, there's that Buddhism that left India before before the first century, and that formed in Sri Lanka and spread there. And it doesn't really get formalized until Buddhaghosa in the 5th century. But then in the meanwhile, in India, you have the development of Madhyamaka Buddhism, right? With Nagarjuna. You have the development of Yogacara with Vasubandhu and Asanga. You have the development of Tantric Buddhism. You have the Tathagata Buddhism, the Womb of the Buddha sutras coming out. You have all these new forms of Buddhism always being invented. And then Buddhism goes to China, and then it gets mixed with Confucianism and Taoism and becomes something totally new. So and then finally it goes to Japan and it changes again, and then it comes to the United States. But it's always changing. It's never static. And I would say that every tenet in Buddhism has been challenged by some famous Buddhist teacher or philosopher or another sect at some point or another.
Yeah. No, this definitely makes sense in the sense of how everything's interconnected and everything is always, in a sense, influencing everything else.
And always changing, so that, here are the Theravadins saying that, well, the core of the Buddhist teachings is non-self, and anatta. And yet we have another group before Theravada called the Puggalavadins who is saying that there is a Puggala, there is a self. And then later on you have the Nirvana Sutras, which is a Chinese sutra saying the idea that there is no self is an early teaching, but we have superseded that with the idea of Buddha nature. There is a essence to human beings. So it's always being debated and changed and challenged. And I think as Buddhism enters new eras, or as it crosses national boundaries to new cultures, it always evolves and changes. It never remains still. So we can talk about how Tibetan Buddhism is really a mixture of the Buddhism that came from Gandhara, which is where some of the teachers came from, the original Buddhist teachers, or in the first dissemination of Buddhism to Tibet. It's a mixture of that, but they're also intermixing with what we now call Bon, which is the native traditions that were there, in the same way that when Zen comes to Japan, it mixes with Shinto. And wherever you go, and so now Zen has come to the West, and it mixes with science and with Christianity and with existentialism and with, it all mixes together in some kind of way. Humanism. So the idea that we're going to find this pure essence, I've read Thanissaro Bhikkhu criticizing a lot of modern Buddhism in the West because it adopts a lot of German romanticism into it. Mm-hmm. That's what happens.
Yeah.
I was talking with Barry Magid, who's one of my favorite Zen teachers, and he gave a conference recently at the Barry Study for Buddhist for Buddhist Studies, and he tells me after the talk he gives or whatever, if someone comes up to him and says, "What you're teaching really isn't Buddhism," and Barry answered, "It is now."
It's great. Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you're saying is really tying in this concept of pluralism, and maybe we can kind of pivot a little bit to your latest book, and the subtitle of your latest book, of The House We Live In, is Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism. What do these three words mean to you, and what do you see the relationship between them?
Well, I understand the virtues as basically skills in living that we can acquire, and if we master them, we never completely master them, but if we practice them and if we value them and we think they're important to our life, then our lives are more likely to go better. And not only our own lives, but the lives of people we care about and live with, the families, our communities, and so forth. So, it's good if people are honest for the most part, and it's good if people display some courage in their lives. It's good if people are basically benevolent towards others and follow the golden rule. These are basic skills that we've learned over 100, 200,000 years of living together and have gotten passed down. So you see a version of the golden rule in every culture I've ever looked at. So that's virtues, I think, are skills for living. Wisdom means showing good judgment. And there are a whole lot of, as you know, in my book, there's a whole lot of different aspects to wisdom. There's both being able to be logical, but there's also being able to be intuitive, to sense the wisdom of the body, and so forth. There's wisdom in the sense of what we call emotional intelligence, of knowing how other people perceive us, of understanding what social situations we walk into are like, of understanding what skills are needed in order to collaborate with other people, not offend them, and so forth. So these are all part of wisdom. And by pluralism, I mean that it's just an acceptance, either joyfully or ruefully, but an acceptance that not everybody thinks the same way. Not everyone sees things the same way. We're all coming from different places. We all have different concerns. And that living in the world you have to accept that other people don't think like you. They see things differently. And the challenge is, how do we live together without killing each other when we have different basic beliefs about all sorts of things? And for me, the answer is that there's a lot that we've learned over the last few hundred years in terms of democratic means of governance, of how do you reach consensus, of how do you reach compromise, of how does everyone get their voice represented, how do we listen respectfully to each other. There are norms and institutions and laws and values and so forth that help promote living together successfully with people who are very different. And that's the most challenging thing for us in this moment as well, when we become so polarized from each other politically. How do we find a way to kind of still collaborate and not fight each other all the time?
Yeah,
because the danger of things is that you always end up we had one civil war already, with how many people were killed in it and how devastating was that. And you want to avoid that as much as possible, which doesn't mean that you always can avoid it. But you want to make it as unlikely as possible that things will go to that point.
Yeah, there's several wars happening in the world right now, and there are people killing each other right now, and
always have been, not just right now. There's never been a time where that hasn't been true.
Yeah. There's almost like you would think that by now we would have figured out how to ameliorate that, and I guess it's probably less people killing each other than in the medieval times where people were dueling left and right. But there is still so much unnecessary violence. Yeah,
the American Senate in the 1800s, every senator carried a gun into the Senate, and there was a situation where one senator beat another one with a cane and so forth. There were we know about the duel between Hamilton and Burr. There was a much more violent time than our current time is.
Yeah, that's actually also an interesting question, because it seems like warfare can get very sophisticated, right? Like there's like information warfare and like biological warfare. Even if we look at COVID, how many people died from COVID, and like I was greatly impacted by that personally, and just we might not see that as the same as somebody taking a gun and shooting somebody, but if you have a country or you have a set of people developing something like that ends up killing millions of people, it's like that's war in itself too. That's warfare and violence also.
Sure.
The other thing I wanted to speak about is you talk about flourishing, like this vision of flourishing, and also what you call a flourishing-based ethics. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I said before, I don't believe in perfect enlightenment. I do believe in something called flourishing, which is a translation of Aristotle's word eudaimonia. It means living the best possible life you can. And so I was trying to kind of talk about what do we mean by that? What does it mean to live the best possible life? So we can talk about what are the qualities that go into a well-lived life. And we can talk about the quality of relationships that we're in. I think for most people, not for everyone necessarily, but for most people, being nested in a group of caring relationships, people you care about and they care about you, is much better than being Robinson Crusoe alone on an island, or being among hostile people all the time. We can talk about accomplishments, and they don't have to be great accomplishments like writing a great novel or winning the Nobel Prize. It could be just solving this morning's Wordle, in the New York Times, or learning how to knit a new sweater, or learning how to garden something. But our days are kind of marked by little challenges that were set, and little ways in which we meet them, and new skills that we learn along the way. And so we want to say that our lives are marked by accomplishments that matter to us. Whether it's exceptional skill on the dance floor, or whether it's being good as being a hostage negotiator or an air traffic control, whatever it is that you're good at, you want to be as good as you can be at it. So there's accomplishment in relationship. there is also a whole realm of aesthetics, of being able to appreciate beautiful things, beautiful tastes, colors, paintings, art, music, and being able to create too. Most of us have some kind of creative passion that whether it's drawing or writing or singing or being part of a chorus or, being part of a quilting group, whatever it is, most of us being a gardener, most of us have some kind of artistic, creative sense that we want to unleash within ourselves. There is also the idea of finding meaning in your life, the idea that my life is meaningful, which for me means that my life matters in a positive way to other people around me, that the world is somehow, and the people I love and care about are somehow better off because I've been in it. I think about that movie, It's a Wonderful Life, that we want to find some meaning in our life. We want to also be, I think mindfulness is very important. We want to be immediately present in our life. We want to be, if whatever emotions we have, we want to be able to feel them. When we're in relationships, we want to be able to feel intimately with other people. We want to be in touch with everything that's going on and not distant and remote from it in some kind of way. I think that adds a very special quality to one's life. It's one of the things I've gotten the most out of meditation, this kind of being present quality. I think we want to be somewhat resilient so that everyone is going to encounter hardship or catastrophe or, my first wife died from cancer. I've had cancer too. There was a time I wanted to get a job and I didn't get it. We all have these kinds of negative events that come into our life. We don't want to be floored by them. We don't want to be stopped in our growth and our progress and our connection to the world by them. We want to find some way to flow on despite these obstacles and find new ways to live and go forward. So those are just some of the things that I talk about that I think go make a kind of a flourishing life, that kind of connection, resilience, achievement, relationship, and meaning, and aesthetics. Those all things. And we're not good at all those things, right? We always have some areas where we're stronger and some are weaker, but I think some of those qualities go into every successful life.
Yeah. A lot of what you said, I feel like most people would agree with it. But then the thing is, like, I think the disagreement for a lot of people is like, how do we get there? How do we get to that place? And it seems like that's where a lot of the disagreement is.
Well, some people don't agree with it. I mean, some people think that the accumulation of power and fame and wealth is really what life is all about. And what the psychological research shows so far is that people who have those as their major values are unhappier than people who value relationships and accomplishments and compassion, and so those actually make people happier in the end. I think some people are I think we teach them bad values, bad in the sense that they don't really lead to flourishing. They just kind of lead to our own sense of embitterment or feeling like we're not successful or we're not enough, I left out one other quality that I think is important for flourishing. That's the quality of acceptance. That not acceptance that everything happens is okay, but acceptance in that when bad things happen, we accept they're happening, and we accept that we have little control over some things in life. And we're not the masters of the universe.
Yeah, there was one thing you were saying, right? As I was listening to you lay out all these values and all these aspects of flourishing, I'm like, yes, everybody would, like, pretty much everybody would agree on most of this stuff. And then I think you mentioned mindfulness and intimacy. And I think for me, I agree with that 100%. But then when I interact with people, I don't know if I feel that with a lot of people. It's like, it feels like a lot of times people don't want to be mindful. They want to kind of distance themselves from what they're feeling and what's happening. And, I'm for good reason, like their system is protecting them from not having to feel a feeling they don't want to feel. And, intimacy also comes with a lot of vulnerability. So there's also this other aspect. Yes, intimacy can be very enlivening and meaningful, but there's also this vulnerability, this other side.
Yes, but accepting your own vulnerability can be one of the greatest routes to hell. And
I agree. Yeah.
And I mean, I have a saying I've had all my life: with the only way out is through. You can't avoid things, and you have to face them, allow them, accept them into your life. And in some ways, I would say, and this is my part of my Buddhism, not welcome them into your life. There's that wonderful Rumi poem about the guest house, which is let everything into your life, welcome them like a welcome guest, because they're here to teach you something.
Yeah, see, like I can't argue against that, because I feel the same exact way.
But you want to point out that you can't always feel that way, and of course you can't, because there isn't such a thing as perfect enlightenment. There's just 10% happier.
Yeah, I want to point out that it seems that what it seems to me is that people have different dispositions. Like, I think I've always been kind of like wanting to go to the dragon rather than wait for the dragon to come to me. But there's a lot of people that don't have that. And maybe like people that are attracted to Buddhism, like, oh, you have to face the things. Like, I say you have to eat the shit sandwich. Like, there's no way around it. Like, right. And when people like, I'll bring up an example that's relevant that was just happening. And, yesterday, like my son was sick and he woke up in the middle of the night just throwing up. And my wife has a crazy fear of throw up. And this was actually like, this is like the second day. Like, he had a day where he threw up. He felt better. He was good. Then he had another, then once again, he throws up. I don't know what's happening. It's some kind of stomach bug. But like, this is the thing that my wife fears the most. And now it's like here. And like, she's trying to do everything to get away from it. And, maybe unskillfully, I'm like, well, you have to face it. It's here, like I'm
you can only do that with yourself. You can't convey that to other people. I think everyone is at a particular point in their life where something is wise for them to do and something isn't. I want to tell a story about this. I used to teach meditation in the psychiatric hospital to psychiatric patients. And every week we'd get together and meditate for about 20 minutes. Okay, whether it's wise or not, I'm not sure now, but we did it. And but people like coming. They like coming. They got a lot out of it. And there was one patient who, while she was inpatient in the hospital for depression, her daughter was murdered. And she was someone who came regularly to my meditation group. And she asked me, she knew enough about meditation at this point that she could make a wise mind decision. She said, what should I do when I come in to meditate? Should I focus in on my breath and not think about what happened to my daughter? Or should I focus in on the feeling of grief and loss? And I say, what do you think you need to do? She says, I think I need to focus in on my breath. I say, go ahead. So she did that for a few weeks, coming once a week. And then after a few weeks, she says, now I think I'm ready to focus in on the feeling. But she made that decision for herself. When am I ready, really? When do I have the ego strength or the capabilities to deal with it? When is it just going to flood me and I can't deal with it? And I think all of us are capable of making that decision. So a lot of people have the same kind of quandary about listening to the news these days. They find themselves getting very upset or depressed by the news. And some of them make the decision not to listen to the news anymore. And some decide to get fully engaged in the political process and what's happening. And I tell people there isn't any right answer. You know your own capabilities. You know whether listening to the news is going to help you do something constructive or whether it's just going to put you into depression and you're not going to be of help to anyone. And you have to listen to your own wise mind in this and kind of navigate it in that kind of way.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought in this aspect of politics and the news. And, this is something that I guess you kind of answered that question in some way, but maybe there's more you can say. I think that there tends to be like these diametrically opposing ways of approaching politics. Well, there's one which doesn't approach politics at all, which is something that we may see in a monastic that renounces the world. And then on the other hand, we have someone who becomes completely immersed in political narratives and gets swept away by the winds of polarization. And neither of these positions appeal to me, although I will say that for a while I was a lot closer to the monastic when it came to dealing with political issues. And, as of late, I've been trying to become more informed on different social issues and trying to figure out how to have better political conversations. So I'm like curious how you have oriented to politics in your own life, especially given your background in Zen Buddhism. Do you have any like other insights of how to engage with politics without falling into these divisive dynamics?
I can make an attempt at it.
Yeah.
First of all, I think there's room in the world for both kinds of people. I mean, there are people who really should be meditating in a cave for 12 years, and they're making their contribution to humanity in that way. And then there are other people who ought to be engaged in the political process, and a lot depends on your temperament and what you feel called to internally. And then the question is how to do what you're doing skillfully. So right now I'm on the coordinating committee for a nationwide Buddhist organization that just formed this month called the Buddhist Coalition for Democracy. And I've been trying to bring together, the group has been trying to bring together people of all political persuasions, whether they're progressives and liberals or whether they're centrists and conservatives, but they value the processes of democracy itself, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the balance of powers, the role of the courts, the free press, So we're concerned about just preserving those institutions as best we can. So then the question becomes, well, how do you do that? How do you do that and not just become more fuel to the fire between competing? So that's something that we're struggling with, And so we recently just came out with wrote a statement of principles and a call to action. And it begins with the recognition of our interdependence and the need for the primacy of compassion for all. And it also says the need to listen to other voices and to listen to them with respect and respond to them with wisdom and with compassion. And I think those are just some of the guiding principles, that we're not here to yell or throw bombs or anything else, but we're here to witness the moment and see what's possible in this moment to create something more creative and more possible. And what those tactics might be is something that we'll have to kind of thrash out. But I feel called to do something in this moment, and I feel called to do it as a Buddhist and not from some other perspective. But I also appreciate that other people don't want to do that or don't think it's reasonable, we talk about engaged Buddhism, when we talk about politically active Buddhism, but another friend of mine has written a couple of blog posts about disengaged Buddhism and its value.
Yeah.
But why can't there be all these voices? Like Mao said, let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like, what I've seen, and that there could be this kind of like shaming or like this. I often hear this in some of the spaces that I'm in online, that it's like, oh, we can't just keep meditating in a cave, or it's like there's things that have to be done. Like there's things that our communities have to do that they're not doing. People want to do these spiritual practices. They want to do all this stuff, but they don't want to speak out against certain things that are happening on a societal level. So I guess I feel that, I hear that, and I hear that cry. And then there's something in that where I'm like, yeah, like I do want to do more. I do want to say more. And sometimes though, I find some of these conversations, like I feel like, oh, I should have the capacity for this, right? And then you show up and there's somebody who's just comes with a certain energy. And then, when you meet that energy in your body, like, whoa, like I'm just going to bring that same energy. And I know that that's not going to lead to
that's not
positive.
That's not your energy. That's not what you're called for in some way. And you have to respect that. You have to respect that. I was thinking of something that just escaped me. So excuse me on that.
Yeah, no worries. I guess the other thing, like you were talking about, you're working with this new organization and you're coming up with all these principles. It makes me think about this kind of well-known problem that, people that study ethics, for example, like ethics professors, aren't necessarily more ethical
absolutely
than
not.
the average person. So it's like, what do you do about that?
Well, none of us live up to our, fulfill all the things that we think we live up to. I mean, there's this model we have of this perfect person, but we know that no perfect person ever existed. I think about all the people that I take as role models, for example, and they had deep personality flaws. I can't imagine a more inspiring figure, for example, in my lifetime than Martin Luther King, especially when I was a teenager and so forth. And yet we know about, during his last days on Earth, a description that Ralph Abernathy wrote about how he had these affairs going on and how he pushed one woman, away from him, physically in a violent way. And, he had a temper, and maybe one reason he was such an advocate for nonviolence is he saw his own capacity for violence. And then he was trying to work with that in some creative way. But we can name it. When I think about all the people that I admire for some aspect of their role, I can think of ways they fell short in their life of being paragons. And that's not that every idol has feet of clay. It's that we're all a mixture of all kinds of tendencies, opposing tendencies. And we're all, we may be inspiring in some ways and failures in other ways. That's just the nature of human imperfection.
Yeah. You bringing that up about MLK and like kind of his shadow side makes me think about Andrew Cohen. Have you heard of Andrew Cohen, the spiritual teacher?
No, I don't know about him. Tell me about him.
I'm actually interested. I'm actually surprised you haven't heard about him. Well, he was kind of a big teacher in the integral space. I don't know if you're familiar with like Ken Wilber. Are you familiar with Ken Wilber?
I know Ken Wilber.
Yeah, so he was kind of like a evolutionary spirituality teacher, and there's a lot of stuff basically started like a cult. And it's quite a fascinating case study because he was very actually transparent towards the end, like when all of that dissolved. And he was very transparent about like, yes, I was wrong and I made all these mistakes and it was a cult and like all these things. And he asked for like forgiveness and all this stuff. And a lot of people obviously didn't forgive him. Some people did. And, he continued to teach in some form, but there was this kind of dark cloud hanging over him for the rest of his life. And he passed away actually the other day. So that's why I was also thinking about him. But I was reading some posts and people talking about how he impacted them in positive ways, despite some of the negative stuff that happened. And yeah, it's interesting because in today's landscape, there is this, if you do something bad, you do one thing that's bad, it's so easy for that one thing to overshadow everything else. And it's interesting. Like, how do we navigate tolerance, right? And I think it's like this, the tolerance paradox, where people say like, oh, if you tolerate intolerance, like you're being intolerant. And it's crazy. Like I had this guest on my podcast, and I won't name him, but people might know who he is because it was probably one of the biggest podcasts I did. And he was talking about going on this other podcast with one of the biggest podcasters in the world. And then basically he said, oh, I'm not going to go because he endorsed Trump. Mm-hmm. And, when I questioned him, I'm like, well, really? I'm like, you're not going to go on this podcast and like have a dialogue with this person just because he endorsed Trump? I think he ended up like blocking me on like Facebook. And it blew my mind because this person is so intelligent, so articulate. A lot of people look up to him. In a lot of ways, I looked up to him as like this kind of intellectual figure. And then there isn't this capacity to have, I guess, this, what you call pluralism, right? The fact that we have different views and that we should be able to discuss them and have these conversations. And
that's right.
Yeah, it saddens me that seems like that's the landscape.
I had that chapter in my book about cancel culture, and I don't know if you got up to it or not, but
I did.
But the fact is that most of the great art and music that's been created in the world has been created by bad people and flawed people. They had the wrong political views, or they were engaged in bad sexual behavior, or there were 100 other things that they did. So there's that question: can I still watch and enjoy a Woody Allen film despite what I think he did, or can I still listen to Wagner's music despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite? And I guess in every case you have to make that decision for yourself. Does it feel okay or not? But if we begin cutting off everyone for every flaw they ever had, we don't read Shakespeare because of The Merchant of Venice, and that was that was anti-Semitic, and we don't listen to Gilbert and Sullivan operettas anymore because he did the Mikado, and that was like appropriation of Japanese culture. And Nobody's left when you're done. Nobody. So you can narrow your world down in that way, and but what does it really benefit you? Picasso was terrible to women. I can't enjoy his art anymore. So I think we do it on a case by case basis, I guess, about what we can forgive, what can allow, how we can separate an artist from a work of art, and then I'd like to keep in mind the idea that nobody is as bad as the worst thing they ever did in their life. And nobody is as good as the best thing they ever did in their life. I mean, it's when I worked as a psychologist early on, for example, I remember doing psychological evaluations on murderers, and they weren't necessarily totally bad people. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong passion, and otherwise I might have liked them as people. They had a lot of good qualities about them. So I've always kept that in mind, that even people who've done very, very terrible things may have good things about them that we could admire and appreciate.
Yeah,
we don't have to take people as a package all at once and and approve of them. We can say, I approve of this about you, and I don't approve of that about you, which is really what we do with our friends, right? We tolerate all their shortcomings because we like certain things about them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is why people sometimes say, I don't want to meet my hero in real life, right? Because then you meet them and it just ruins it, because it's like, oh, he has all these flaws. He's actually not perfect.
But it doesn't have to ruin it. It could just be,
can make it better.
That's human.
Wow, he's a human.
Yeah. Hey, you're a human being. It's certainly true in the Zen world, where a lot of very, very famous teachers were guilty of sexual abuse and alcoholism and all sorts of things. And maybe some of them shouldn't have been teachers, because they just they were not ensuring the well-being of their students. And on the other hand, I know some of their students who got great benefit from them. And you can't deny that was true.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's also like a lot of teachers that I've looked up to or found something useful, and then something comes out, some kind of a sex scandal or something, and it's like, this him too, this person too. Yeah, like, damn, they're all falling.
They're all human.
I've definitely had an experience of somebody who I considered kind of like a mentor, and I've come to see kind of this person having many negative patterns and having negative influence, and I seen how they had a lot of fallouts with a lot of people. But then when I reflected on my relationship, because I feel like I had strong boundaries, I was actually able to learn a lot from this person and gain a lot. And it was like, but I can see when other people would speak negatively, I'd be like, I can see how that played out in that way. But yeah, it's interesting how we can you can learn from anybody, and there might be something you can learn from that person, and doesn't mean that they're wise in every single way.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
This also makes me think of there was a spiritual teacher, Ram Dass, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, and he used to, when he was still alive, he had like two pictures on his like altar, and it was like a picture of Obama and a picture of Donald Trump, and he would have them both and like try to send both of them love and try to see them as part of himself as well. So it's kind of beautiful way of seeing, the shadow of like seeing what triggers us most, what politicians trigger us most, what people trigger us most. How can we learn to have compassion for them too?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's our practice, right? To have compassion for everybody. It's hard to do sometimes. We're not always very good at that, but that's the goal, to see how much we can expand our hearts to include everybody.
Yeah. So, you mentioned some stuff about enlightenment actually when we started, and I guess it seems like for you, maybe what you hear in the traditional teachings is like there's this perfection or this place to get to, and then there's more of like, there's an opening and I can be either more or less enlightened, but there isn't this like crossing over and like I get there, I'm there, and now I'm enlightened, and now I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you want to ask about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing about what's possible, and also like what enlightenment is, right? Because my sense is, I guess earlier on in my journey, when I would hear about enlightenment or awakening, I'm like, okay, they're all talking about the same thing, right? Like it's this kind of perennialist view. All the traditions are pointing to the same realization. And then the more you listen and the more teachings you kind of pick up on and different traditions you engage in, you start seeing like, oh, actually, there's so much disagreement. You have all these people that are actually clashing, like, and there would be this whole notion of like Dharma wars, like, people arguing about like which Dharma is the real Dharma, which enlightenment or awakening is the real awakening. And then there's kind of like this realization of like, okay, maybe there's many different types of awakening and enlightenment. Maybe, and you see this not just across different religious traditions, like in, Christian mysticism or Sufism or Buddhism, like you see it within, right? Like if you look in Buddhism, what can be described as awakening or enlightenment in Theravada seems to be very different than what is described in Mahayana, or very different than what's described in Vajrayana. So I guess that touches on this, notion of pluralism and how there's so many ways that maybe awakening or enlightenment can express itself.
Yeah, when I think about the idea of enlightenment as something we never, in a horizon we go towards but never reach, I also think about it as being multidimensional. And it may be that at some point these dimensions meld together and become more one, but I don't think they were at first. So we can talk about some people who have these deep mystical experiences where they experience the oneness of all things. But there are a lot of people who have hundreds of those experiences. Take LSD, I remember in the 60s, people take 100 trips. It doesn't change them at all. They're still jerks, after.
Yeah.
So, there is that appreciation for the oneness of all things, but it's not everything. There's also an ethical path of developing compassion and equanimity and loving kindness. And that's a separate track than I think the big picture of unity track is. Because I don't think that just seeing the interconnection of everything automatically makes you a universally compassionate person. And I think there are a whole bunch of separate, there's the capacity for intimacy and presence, which is another dimension to it, of being here in the moment, the kind of Ram Dass be here now thing. It's a third dimension there. And I think we can pick apart a whole bunch of dimensions that are separate. And they may connect as we develop each of these areas, they may all connect together in some way. I haven't found that true for myself, but it may be. Maybe I just haven't gone far enough yet. But I think there are people who excel in one way or another, and I think there's a early Buddhist sutta about this, where the Buddha is introducing people to the Sangha, a visitor to the Sangha, and he's saying, here's so and so, he's really good at this, and here's so and so, he's really good at that, and these are all arhats, but they're good at different things. So anyway, that's the way I prefer to think about it, that there are a whole bunch of different tracks that we can progress on.
Yeah, there's actually a couple of things that are coming up for me in hearing that. Well, there's this one practitioner, Daniel Ingram.
Yes.
And you've heard of him. Yeah, his book was really impactful for me. And in that book, he talks about mastering the core teachings of the Buddha. That's the name of the book. He talks about like there's these three trainings, right? There's training in insight, there's training in concentration, and there's training in morality. And, insight and concentration, you kind of really only get through meditation practice. But morality is kind of just the way you live your life, and you get that through your relationships. So you could have somebody who focuses a lot on meditation and develops immense concentration and insight, but then they lack the morality. Or you can have the opposite, somebody who's very good moral person, but they don't understand emptiness, or they don't have this level of concentration that allows them to perceive some of these insights.
Yes, I think that's very true.
The other thing that was coming up, have you ever heard of Bruce Tift?
Say the name again?
Bruce Tift.
No, I don't know him. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you actually remind me, like there's something about you that reminds me a lot about him. And he's sometime. Yeah, for sure. He's also a longtime Buddhist practitioner, Vajrayana practitioner, like 40 years. And he's a licensed marriage family therapist. Well, he used to be, right? He's retired now. He has a book also that I really appreciate. I think it's a wonderful book. It's called Already Free. And in that book, he basically differentiates the path, the developmental path and the fruitional path.
Ah, yes. Uh-huh.
And like the developmental path, the way I see it is kind of like the healing, the therapeutic, like the type of work you would do in therapy. And then the fruitional path is awakening. It's this immediacy. It's another way I like to see it is like the developmental path is like, how do I improve this, my story, my narrative? And the awakening path is like, how do I drop it? Right.
Right.
And then he kind of, he differentiates these two different streams.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that helpful because I find that we could sometimes like kind of clump all these different aspects into one thing. But it seems like a lot of what I hear of in other traditions, other people talk about awakening, it's very different than what you might think of as flourishing or like improving. Let's improve the world. Let's live our best lives. It's very different in what I hear, where it's like, like life is already perfect. There's actually nothing to improve. Like that's a very different kind of lens.
Different message, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And it's a paradox, the difference between the two. And I think the art of Zen, at least, and maybe other forms of it too, is to live that paradox, to kind of understand both sides of it as both possibly being true and part of a larger whole that's kind of hard to grasp and hard to articulate. But the worst thing about Zen is when you think about it as a linear process of going from one A to B to C to D and E, and you're growing each time. There's much more dropping of things than there is attaining things in Zen.
Yeah. And, now that you're mentioning Zen, I'm actually also really curious about your experience with like being ordained and becoming a Zen priest. Wondering what was the significance? What is the significance of that for you? What does that mean to be a Zen priest? What does that entail? And maybe, like how did, there's a difference of, I guess, like I'm fairly engaged with Buddhism, like I have a committed practice, but I'm wondering what it means to be like a Zen priest or to be a Buddhist. Is there something that you feel that was afforded in that process of becoming ordained and becoming a priest that wasn't available before?
Well, I'm not saying, I think it could have been available in other ways. There were certain things that became available to me because I was a priest that weren't there before. For example, I before COVID, I worked for 4 years as a volunteer chaplain in a local hospital.
Yeah.
And you needed to be ordained in order to do that. And that was one of the things I was thinking about when I did ordain. I would love to be able to do that kind of work. I had been a psychotherapist, psychologist. I had retired from that. And the idea of meeting people one-on-one, but just for 1 hour, because this is an acute care hospital. People are in and out the next day, right? You have just one meeting, as we say in the tea ceremony, right? You have this one moment to be with someone and come together in some kind of way and maybe be transformative in some way with their lives. And I found that an extraordinary experience. And I couldn't have done that without having ordained first. I like the idea that I now run a Zen Sangha, not as a teacher, because I'm not authorized as a teacher at this point, but I do lead it and organize it and cultivate the culture that's there, and people look at me in that kind of role as a kind of a minister in some kind of way, that suits my own interests and talents to kind of play that kind of role right now. But I could have done it. I mean, there are plenty of secular Buddhist, teachers or heads of sanghas who aren't ordained. The other thing it is it gave me a chance to kind of more deeply explore the tradition. I mean, I wanted to learn. I wanted to be able to do things like marry people and bury people, and I thought the community needed people who could do that. But also, I wanted to, I've been learning Chinese because I want to go more deeply into the koan literature and understand it better. I've been reading a lot more of the liturgy, and in our Zen group, for example, we do one koan a week, not for enlightenment purposes, not as gateway to enlightenment, but just to understand the context and what the story is about and what it points to in a more kind of intellectual way. So we've gone through a couple hundred of them now, but it's given me a chance in this role to learn more about the tradition than I ever would have done just on my own. And it's also, in the process of, before I was ordained as a cleric, I was ordained as a lay Buddhist through a Jukai, the ceremony of taking the precepts. So that was a 2-year opportunity to work individually with a teacher about each of the 16 Bodhisattva precepts and work through my understanding of it. So it's been my own path to learning, as well as my own path to see how to be of service. The other thing I've loved about it is it's enabled me to be part of a larger pastoral community in town. So it's been defunct since COVID, but our town had a wonderful interfaith clerical group where rabbis and ministers and priests and Buddhist priests, got together every month and had lunch and talked about working on certain kind of social projects together within the community, or talked about the ways in which our religions are the same or different in some ways. And it was a great comradeship between people. I felt very close to. There was a Baptist minister in my community I became very emotionally close to in terms of working with him, and a couple of rabbis who I got into dialogues with in public about my book, for example. I value those friendships immensely, and I don't think that would have happened if I hadn't ordained. So it's another path to service in the world, or working together in the community that kind of build the community together and knit it together.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It kind of makes me think about this, and I feel like we've kind of danced around this question, a little bit. But what role, if any, do religious traditions play in wisdom cultivation? And this kind of comes back to this notion of secularism, and we kind of spoke about. We use John. I was using John Kabat-Zinn as an example, but you mentioned that he had this deep engagement with this tradition, and probably still does. And then he was teaching something that was like, all right, how do I give something that's more accessible to the average person? So it's like, what is the value of the tradition, of being deeply rooted in a tradition, in our ability to cultivate wisdom? And is there something that, that's being lost in our society now, when you see a lot of traditions being kind of diminished, and there's more of this spiritual but not religious thread, and traditions in a lot of ways are being diminished? Do you think there's something that's lost in that?
Something lost and something gained, right? The first law of Buddhism is everything changes, everything is impermanent. And everything is moving according to the Tao, everything is emerging in this next moment based on all the causes and conditions, and things arise as they can. Is something lost? Sure. I find it helpful to be rooted in a tradition, but on the other hand, I'm very unorthodox within that tradition.
Yeah.
In other words, I don't feel I have to hold to the tradition. I can be a critic within that tradition. That's a preferred role for me than being outside the tradition entirely. I think tradition embodies a lot of the wisdom of the path that has taken hundreds and maybe thousands of years to learn through experience. Many, many people dealing with the same kinds of questions. And then it also carries forwards the prejudices of the past and limitations of the past. So what could the Buddha have known about modern astrophysics or about molecular biology or chemistry? How different would he be if he appeared today, with the access to all that knowledge? Everyone is a prisoner of their own time in a way. And so I think traditions emerge into the present and carry forth wisdom, but they also carry liabilities along with them too. So we can talk, for example, about the cult-like quality of a lot of Zen groups, or we can talk about the patriarchal quality that gets carried forward. There are all kinds of things we don't want to carry forward from the tradition also.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your perspective. And, one thing that you said that was sticking out was like, I'd rather be in the tradition and being like a critic of it than outside. Then I think, like, how is it possible for us to criticize a tradition if we're not deeply engaged. And probably like some of the best criticism comes from the fact that if you engage with the tradition, you understand it. Like it takes some level of understanding something before you might have like a rebuttal against it, or like know enough to be like, okay, I see some of the patterns, or I see some of the things here, and like I don't agree with this.
Right. So when I wrote my first book, Buddhism and Human Flourishing, which is before the most recent one, I'd been practicing over 20 years at that point. And at the first 20 years, I didn't feel like I knew enough to be a critic in any kind of way about some traditional Buddhist ideas. And then there was the whole sense of fear about writing some book like this, and knowing so many. I talked with Stephen Batchelor about this. How did you get your nerve to write your first book? After you'd been a Tibetan monk and after you'd been a Korean Zen monk, how could you write a book that would alienate almost all of the people who came before you that were dear friends? That takes real. I mean, you have. Do you want to really do that? So I had to deal with those questions too before I wrote the book. But I found a comfortable place to be. I guess that it's all right if not everyone approves of what I have to say, and I'm just here to offer these thoughts. I'm not telling you the truth. I'm saying, hey, here's something to think about. You might benefit from it. You might not, but think about it.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate this conversation, Seth. We've covered so much. We've, spoke a lot about Buddhism, and particularly the naturalistic, pragmatic, eudaimonic, cosmopolitan version of it. We've touched a little bit on some of the things from your book, such as ethics and flourishing and virtue. And we've touched a little bit on what an engaged path might look like and how we could navigate politics. And as well as enlightenment, we've spoke a little bit about that. I'm curious if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap this up. Is there anything that you have on your radar? Anything else you want to mention?
Yeah, just that I've enjoyed myself today. You're a great conversationalist and a great host, podcast host, and I'm glad I came on with you today. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seth. It means a lot. And it really can feel your kind of wisdom and your temperance and level-headedness with just the way you approach Buddhism, the way you approach reality, the way you seem to speak about politics. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And it's great to, I love this podcast because I feel like I get to speak to people, a lot of smart people, some wise people, and, people that are way ahead of me, way further on in life. And, you're like an elder, like Bruce Tift is like that. I've spoken to David Loy, and it's great to be able to speak with people that have engaged with these practices for way longer, and to kind of see how it manifests in their lives.
Yeah. Be well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much.